going to be an intriguing matchup, right? As Miami and Ohio State go at it. And, I talked about Miami on my channel about a week ago, and I highlighted all the great things that they've done this season, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. I remember when they first hired Corey Heatherman, and I was thinking to myself, hey, that background at Minnesota, also his background in terms of coaching linebackers and the defensive line, and just how much of that experience and that background has been the forefront of Miami's success this season. When you look at guys like Bain and Mesidor and just how impressive those guys have been, that's really going to be the key to their success in this game, right? Because the one thing that I think it often gets overlooked about Ohio State, particularly their matchup against Indiana, is the fact that Ohio State gave up 5 sacks in that game. And I think to myself, if Indiana's defensive line can get home, why can't Miami's? And I think that's a worthy question of being asked, right? Because, you know, Miami's in that spot right now that Mario Cristobal's fourth year, where we are finally at the point now where we can realistically see Miami kind of talked about in the national championship conversation, right? And, you can talk about him in a number of different ways. You can talk about a lot of the nonsense that he does in terms of game management, but what you can't take away from him is just how phenomenal of a recruiter he is, and the fact that he is a player's coach and just somebody that is really well liked, articulate, and just very personable. And I think you see that a number of different ways in terms of kind of how Miami is showing up, and most importantly, I think what Miami showed in that win versus Texas A&M is just them kind of vindicating themselves being in this situation to begin with. But they are continuing to try to make their historical run right now. And this is the first time they've played in this kind of predicament since the 2002 national championship game. And I won't get into the controversy of that, but nevertheless, I mean, if you're Ohio State, I think you have to feel relatively confident about where you're at right now, right? Yeah, sure, you lost to Indiana, and arguably that game should have went into overtime anyway with the missed field goal. So I think you have to take that with a grain of salt, especially since you knew both teams were going to go into the playoff anyway. But you would have loved to be able to go into this thing being undefeated and most importantly winning the Big Ten title. But what Ohio State is excellent at, aside from just having NFL talent all over the field, particularly on the defense side of the ball, is the way that they get to you is through their line play and through their speed on the outside. And I think if you're Miami, I think you're going to have a really difficult time in terms of them moving the football. And I think ultimately that's going to be what their big challenge is, right? Because Mark Fletcher, he ran for over 150 yards versus Texas A&M, and Texas A&M showed signs of not being able to stop the run in other games this season. But Ohio State isn't going to have that problem, and the reality is, I think Mark Fletcher is a stud. He's a guy that is going to have a great college career. I think he's only getting started. I think he's only going to get better from here. But what's going to be Miami's problem, just like what we saw, in other instances this year, is the reality that is Carson Beck is only going to take you so far. And I think that's what this game is going to prove, right? Because, Matt Patricia has done a phenomenal job this year with this group. Number 5 in terms of rush defense and number 1 in terms of pass defense in the country. And I just find it very difficult how Carson Beck is just all of a sudden going to dice up this Ohio State defense. And I think one thing that Miami does deserve credit for, and what, Shannon Dawson, their offense coordinator, deserves a lot of credit for, is they've really been creative in terms of how they use Tomey, for example. And, they do have a lot of young talent on this team, and they're only going to continue to get better. They're only going to continue to develop. And I don't really foresee a situation where a lot of those kids are going to transfer. I think they'll be able to get a lot of guys that are currently on the team onto next year. But, that's really going to be the key question, right? It's not so much, hey, does Miami have the talent? It's going to be how big of a moment can these young guys really step up and to what degree? Because the reality is Carson Beck's a solid quarterback, right? I mean, we've seen him in a number of big moments with Georgia, but the reality is that he is a good quarterback, but not a great quarterback. He's got a solid arm, but not a great arm. And this isn't me necessarily, you know, calling him shitty or something like that. This is just kind of objectively speaking when you're comparing Carson Beck to some of the other quarterbacks that we've seen in the country. And the other thing is too, if you're Miami, not just, I think the main issue that Miami is going to have is on the offense side of the ball. But even when you look at Miami defensively, right? I mean, we can talk about the defensive line all day. We know about Bain and Mesidor and all those guys in that front seven. But here's what else is Miami has to contend with. You got to contend with that receiving core of Smith, of Carnell Tate, and Brandon Ennis too. And to expect Bain and Mesidor to be able to get to the quarterback in 2 seconds on every play, I don't know how realistic that is. And I do think if you're Ohio State, another fascinating storyline is going to be is the fact that Brian Hardline's not calling plays. They announced last week that Ryan Day is going to be calling plays. And I'm really fascinated in terms of how different their offense is going to look. And I get why they did, and I get why they did it and whatnot too. But I think it's going to be a storyline in this game that I think is going to be probably one of the critical moments of this entire college football playoff run, right? Because if Ohio State does come out somewhat sluggish on the offense side of the ball, a lot of people are going to be pointing towards, oh, well, Ryan Day shouldn't have been calling plays, or oh, he shouldn't have messed with anything. But the reality is that there's a reason why Ohio State is the best team in the country. It's because they have they have the most talent in the country. It's because they're the most consistent, and quite frankly, it's just because they have NFL talent all over the field. And I keep saying that over and over again, but that's just the reality of it, right? And there's a reason why both defenses have been pretty aggressive, all things considered, this year. They've been excellent at tackling. They don't give up a lot of yards, and for the most part, they're relatively consistent too. And also as well, when you're the Buckeyes, you have that defensive line in terms of Caden McDonald and Caden Curry, and you have guys like Sonny Styles and Arvell Reese who are constantly making plays for you throughout the field. And you have guys like Caleb Downs who are holding down that secondary. And when you kind of put that all together, as great as the Hurricanes have been, and they can prove that they can hang with any team in the country, ultimately talent's talent, right? It adds up. It's something that X's and O's can only take you so far. And although, like I said before, that the Canes secondary has been, quite frankly, pretty exceptional this season, and they deserve a lot of credit. Ultimately, the difference makers is going to be that Ohio State is simply a more talented team right now. And if you're the Buckeyes, what I'm really kind of curious about offensively is what's going to happen to them in those kind of short down, 3rd and 1s, 3rd and 3s, 3rd and 4s. Because to me, if I'm Ohio State, aside from Ryan Day's play calling, the big storyline for me is how effective is Ohio State going to be in terms of running the football? I think, Julian Sain, I can't say enough about him, right? For him to be a freshman and come in with, the talent that he has and playing relatively really smart football. You can tell he has a really high football IQ, and he does all the little things really well. So I can only say enough good things about him. But what's really going to be the big difference maker in terms of Ohio State right now, and what's going to be the catalyst for them to make it to the national championship game, if they do, is they have to be able to run the ball effectively. And I think that's what they really have to be able to prove this weekend, particularly in those short situations, right? Because I mentioned a couple games ago, a couple moments ago where they have shown signs where that offensive line can be exploited to some degree. There have been a couple moments where you know the rushing attack hasn't necessarily been as prevalent, but I think this is a really good opportunity to kind of say to yourself, "Hey, you have a really talented defensive front that you're going up against. You're by all accounts pretty heavily favored in this game. I've seen betting lines up to 10 points, which I don't think is entirely unreasonable. But at the same time, a lot of eyes are going to be on Ohio State, especially when, I've said it over and over again statistically, best defense in the country. They've been, you know, they've been kicking ass and taking names all season. But to me, this is going to be kind of that big moment for them where how does that play calling come together? How well is this entire defense going to really kind of come together and be able to disrupt Carson Beck? And most importantly, what other cracks will we might see this weekend versus Miami? But if you ask me, I think this is going to be just another day of Ohio State taking care of business. But